Hello, my name is Alex Segerman. Welcome to the webinar, Cairo Modern, a discussion with Dr. Mohamed Elsahed. I am professor of Islamic art history at Rutgers, Newark, and we're coming to you live here from Intro to Islamic Architecture with some Rutgers, Newark students. So doing a sort of new version of this webinar, but we're delighted to have Dr. Elsahed here with us today. He was supposed to give a talk in March of 2020, so that got canceled, and we're really delighted to have him back. Dr. Mohamed Elsahed is a curator and architectural historian focusing on modernism in Egypt and the Arab world. He is author of a fantastic book named Cairo Since 1900, an architectural guide published by AUC Press in 2020, which is the first comprehensive survey of the city's modern architecture, including 226 buildings in 17 geographic areas built from 1900 to the present. He graduated from NJIT, just right across the street from us here at Rutgers, Newark, and then earned a master's from the Aga Khan program at MIT and a PhD from NYU's Department of Middle Eastern Studies. His work spans architecture, design, and material culture, and in 2011, he founded the fantastic CairoObserver.com, which started out with 6 printed issues of a magazine distributed for free in events in Cairo, Beirut, and Dubai, aiming to stimulate public debate around issues of architecture, heritage, and urbanism in the region. And he's currently continuing the work of Cairo Observer with a fantastic Instagram account, Cairo Observer. I encourage everyone to follow it. Today, he's going to be speaking to us specifically about his new exhibit, Cairo Modern, which is at the Center for Architecture in New York City. Some of the students and I visited over the weekend, and it's fantastic, and it's up until January 22nd. So if you're in the region, please take the opportunity to go and check it out. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Elsahed, and then after he finishes speaking, we're going to have some questions from the audience. But if you have questions for him, please put those in the Q&A, and I will have some of our students pose those questions to him after that, and we should be wrapping up around 11 o'clock. So thank you, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see. So thanks so much, Alex. Alex and I have known each other for years. We've both been fellows at the American Research Center in Egypt in the past 10 years, when being a researcher in Egypt was not necessarily the easiest thing in the world. Just trying to make this full screen really quick. There you go. All right. So thank you, Alex, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to this group about Cairo Modern, an exhibition that just opened last month, October 1st, at the Center for Architecture in New York. What I'll do is maybe I'll give an overview of the exhibition, even though your group has seen it, but just so that we're all on the same page, I'll give it an overview of the exhibition with some of the main ideas, its organization, some of the figures, stories that are mentioned or are told within the exhibition space, and how it links to, I guess, what I'm working on at large. And then maybe this will take about 35 minutes, and then we can, I'm very eager to engage with the group and their questions and discussion on the exhibition and larger issues. So thank you for that. The exhibition Cairo Modern was set to open last March at the Center for Architecture in their downstairs space, actually. So a silver lining of the delay because of the pandemic is that now it's on the street level space. It's in the street level space, which is fantastic. It is accompanying the book, as Alex mentioned. And the book came out in March 2020. It is basically, it's important for me to say two things. One, it's the first of its kind in that particular format, in the sense that it includes projects that span the entire geography of the city. Of course, that is a conditioned statement. It's impossible to really include the entire geography of any city into a single architectural guidebook, but at least it moves away from the geographic parameters that have been the constraints of previous studies, which usually looked at what we call downtown and a few other areas that were populated with buildings from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. That's typically what's gotten attention sort of before us, I suppose, my generation of scholars. More and more people have been working on the legacy of 20th century architecture in various locations of the global south. Egypt was the natural spot for me to go back to, and we can talk about that later as well. Why Cairo, why Egypt, and so on. So the exhibition, if you've been to the space before, if you're familiar with it, it's the main space and the atrium and the small side gallery. It's organized, just an overview in case people haven't been to the exhibit, of the organization of the space. And I just want to say that organizationally, everything is kind of put into three, let's say, tiers, if you think of it as like three layers of a cake of some sort. At the bottom strip are 20 examples of buildings that were half of which more or less have been demolished. Those are buildings selected from the 1930s to the 1970s, which was actually the period that I focused on for my PhD dissertation. It was the 30s to the 70s, but in order to later on sort of put that period in context, it was very important to go back some decades before that and some decades after that. The book itself, Cairo since 1900, comes all the way to the present, with some projects that are actually still in progress until now, already included in the book. So the bottom tier of the exhibition space has the 20 examples that are selected from the 216 buildings that are in, or sites that are in the book. The middle slice, let's call it, is a kind of an informational layer. This is where you find information about, let's say, architects' biographies, so you can learn about a few of the architects and their stories. Excuse me. You can learn about thematics such as Cairo during World War II, the modern house, the apartment block, these kind of standard themes or lenses through which we can visit this material. And you also get to learn about certain geographic areas. It's a vast city. My assumption, I'm very aware that this is primarily going obviously to be visited by an audience in the exhibition. Everybody knows various districts of Cairo are, so it was important to also include that in that informational layer. The top layer is kind of more or less a kind of a discursive William Curtis, because not only because textbook that I studied, but it's also that textbook that has been in education since 1982, with millions of copies all around the world, translated in many languages. So if we are going to tackle the architectural survey as it stands today, might as well start with one that's widely read globally, which is still extremely Eurocentric and clearly has very particularly views that are very informed by a very particular perspective. But that's still pretty much the most common textbook. So William Curtis, you'll see quotes by him up there, but also by Sayyid Karim, who is basically a main figure, let's say, in the story of modernism that I'm trying to tell through the experience of what happened in a place like Cairo. So and also Frank Lloyd Wright, who's visited Cairo in 1957, just before he died, and didn't have very nice things to say about the work of Egyptian architects that he saw. So in a way, that player, that discursive space is linking some of the various threads of narrative that you see throughout the exhibition and other areas as well. So that's more or less organizationally. And then there are also these two side stories that are essentially Egyptian-American exchanges, two examples. And they're in the little side gallery. One is, again, like I mentioned, Frank Lloyd Wright visiting Cairo in 1957. And so we have a little bit of how at least the story was published within the Egyptian Architectural Press, and what Frank Lloyd Wright had to say about Egyptian modernism or what's being practiced in Cairo at the time. And the other story is from 1939, when Egypt had proposed a pretty lavish pavilion to represent the country at that World's Fair in New York. The outbreak of World War I, and given that Egypt was still under British colonial control, particularly militarily and economically, any projects such as this were canceled as the country went into a war economy. And so the pavilion was never realized, but we at least get to learn about it, again, through material that's been published and descriptions and so on. And this artwork, this tiny fragment of the artwork that was intended to line the entire, the whole interior of the pavilion. We only have two fragments that were published. I'm sure with additional research, we can hopefully maybe find more details of what that artwork should have looked like. But what you're seeing here is a full one-to-one scale reproduction of that fragment that we have, which is actually how it was intended to be. So that androgynous figure pulling the tiger, the bottom, that's kind of the scale figure that's meant to be, full size. So we're seeing it for the first time printed in New York at the scale it was intended to be. So these are the two side stories. And I think, the other element, I suppose, that I should point out is the timeline. Are you seeing this full screen, or are you also seeing all the noise, all the little windows that are open? If someone can just... Alex?
We're also seeing the windows.
You're seeing the windows. Ah, I see. I'll get rid of that. Maybe if I do this. Oh, there you go. All right, so then the third element I would say that is worth pointing out is the timeline. It was very important for me to position these 20 specimens of buildings that were, or sites that were selected for the exhibition in a sort of, in a sort of timeline. But as an exercise, it would turn into something that, when I started out with this timeline, I didn't have actually, I thought it would look very different, but luckily working with the graphic designer, Ahmed Hammoud, who also designed the book, bringing the two of us together came up, I guess, with what you see in front of you. I don't think this would have been possible without a talented designer to sort of translate all this information into a single wall. And the idea was to really try to position not only the buildings, but then other benchmarks or moments within the history of modern architecture or architectural practice in 20th century Egypt in general in that timeline, and then to put all of that in context, let's say within, in reference to maybe more famous iconic benchmarks in the history of modern architecture, 20th century architecture. And that necessitated for me that I also add a layer of political and cultural events around the world that sort of impact the development of architecture directly or indirectly. So it ended up being this multi-layered, it's an exercise, and it's something that I hope that, like many other aspects of the exhibit, which is pretty simple in its form, I think, but I think it's really all in the content. I think it was really important to really be able to see a snapshot of the 20th century on one wall, where these new buildings are not being discussed out of context, but particularly in context of political and cultural benchmarks around the world that really shaped the big picture. So it ended up being, like I said, this sort of 4-category timeline: Egypt architecture, world architecture history, Egypt history, world. I'm very excited about this, and I'm looking forward to hear what you think about it and to see how this can develop further. Essentially, it's an argument against the linearity of art and architectural history that's been sort of the inherited viewpoint of how we can discuss and review history from the Enlightenment onwards. This kind of, if I may say, failed project that we're all still burdened with. So an argument against that is to actually, well, to highlight that history is not linear, that there are multiple, very, very complex and multiple ways, networked, overlapping ways in which a history can be read. So anyway, it's one of the many provocations that I try to include within the span of the exhibit. So now that I've gone through briefly the sort of components, just in case there are some who haven't been able to visit, I'll quickly run through the 20 examples of buildings that are shown in the exhibit. A couple of things to highlight here are sources, and that's something that I think we should be talking about more in the discussion. I'll just flag some of these issues. If you notice, a lot of the images used in the exhibition come from printed sources, published sources, Al-Imara magazine in particular. And this is why there is an entire wall dedicated to Al-Imara, because it's very significant to this particular research, but also it allows me to open up to the audience about sources, about the importance of magazines in this particular context, and also about the fact that if we're relying on magazines publish, a drop in the bucket of what's going on. Just think about right now. Do you think, even in New York, where you have a plethora of publications around architecture and design, do you think simply picking up a magazine from the newsstand gives you a clear and complete picture of what's going on? Of course not. So if this is all we have, then I'm afraid instead of being excited only about the information that we're finding in these kinds of sources, I'm also very much alarmed that it's an awareness that the kind of information and buildings that are published are a drop in the bucket. So if we have this much, then we've lost quite a lot. And when I say lost, I talk both in the sense of the physical presence of the buildings. A lot of them have been demolished, which was one of the main points that I'm driving through the book, but also the exhibition. And this is not a sort of, and I'm again going to flag topics that we can hopefully discuss at more length in the discussion, but the issue of preservation is one that we should talk about, because my stance on it is not preservationist impulse as we've seen in post-war to Europe, let's say. It's a very different drive or relationship to the notion of preservation. I'm much more interested in the preservation of information and history, and to be able to have a population of a city first aware of its own built environment, the history of its built environment, especially if it's a city that's undergoing quite a lot of rapid transformation under colonial, post-colonial, whatever you like to call it, forces that are essentially reshaping the urban landscape. So a lot of these buildings are gone. A lot of their histories are gone. The ones that are included in the book and the exhibition are the ones that are, let's say, lucky enough that we have a little bit of information about. At least we have a photograph, we have some description by the architects in some cases as published. But at any rate, it was important for me to start also with the 1930s, not only because this was the period that I started with for my PhD research, but I think the 1930s are, for the history of modern architecture, are quite significant and emblematic. This is also the decade, 1933 is when Saeed Karim, who's very visible in the exhibition and book, that's when he arrives in Zurich to pursue a master's at ETH Zurich. Hitler had just risen to power next door. So it wasn't a very friendly space to be an Egyptian architecture student. And so you can imagine the kinds of things that he would have had to face. One example that I was able to pull out from the archive at ETH was the fact that he had to take multiple classes paid without credit, simply to prove that as an Egyptian, he's capable of completing an architecture degree at ETH Zurich. I can leave it at that, but I just want to put that in context because I think there's a kind of a discrepancy in our inherited image of the development of modern architecture that is completely divorced from political realities. And the 1930s, you can learn about the 1930s from the political lens and learn about the rise of fascism and the events that ultimately led to World War II. But you can also, from a history book of architecture, get a very aesthetically pleasing representation of the 1930s with villas and modernist houses and so on, mostly by European architects, some of whom had relationships with these problematic political regimes and so on. So I think the 1930s have this kind of bipolar, I think, reception in sort of understanding in public perception. So it was important to also position modernist architecture, the Egyptian context, from that period. I'm saying this to say that there is obviously, my argument is that it didn't start in the 1930s. It simply happens to be a useful starting point. But one of the things that I find, or that I found since I started really working on this topic, is a lot of the conventions that were taught, for example, about development of modernist architecture and thinking, is a particular relationship to tradition, which is completely absent in this context. So what does modernity mean for these architects and their clients? Well, it's very gray. It's very difficult to pin it down. But it certainly isn't based on a notion of rejection of tradition or what preceded what's being referred to as the modern, which is actually another interesting point that I hope we discuss a bit further, which is the significance of the word modern, modernist, and modernism, none of which were really part of the discourse of these architects. I don't think many people outside particular geographies were concerned with how to call things. So the word modern and modernist as stylistic, let's say, tools to sell a product, which is the modern house, or a particular aesthetic. None of those were really mobilized in this particular way in this context. So I think these are things that are important to notice and to tease out from the stories of the various buildings. There are other aspects there's really an endless array of potential lenses through which to read any urban landscape. But this one offers, I think, and I'm not saying it's unique, but I think because we have some published sources, because we have voices, because we have photographs, because of its geographic location, because of when we're talking, what was going on in Egypt, colonialism, and other forces that we have seen in hindsight unfold in particular ways. This is Sayyid Karim that I've mentioned. Just to stop here at Sayyid Karim and pause, the reason I mention all of this, because Sayyid Karim is a figure that I think, had this been an even playing field, he would have been someone in our sort of global, in English language, understanding of the history of modernism. But it is not an even playing field. It never is. It still isn't today. And someone like him was very ambitious, driven by politics of independence, and so on, ends up being put under house arrest. His career ends in 1965. This is not the first time this sort of thing has happened in Egypt. I had just recently mentioned on one of the Instagram posts, Max Herz Pasha. This was the Jewish Austro-Hungarian architect who, since 1881, was basically in charge of the documentation, preservation, and listing of ancient Arab, Islamic. These categories are very loose, so we can talk about that as well. Architecture, and in 1914 he was kicked out by the British when the Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the war. So we've seen already before Sayyid Karim many incidents actually, but we've yet to really be able to enumerate all of them, in which colonial and then handed over to national political powers. I have a big question mark about what was the nature of this transition from a colonial Egypt as a colonial state transforming into a nationalist state. I think we have enough hindsight and clues to be able to not take this as face value. I remember when I was a student, a lot of the the works that that I had access to, that I was starting to see, were about a full sort of belief in the post-colonial project as if it was, but I think now we know a little bit more that necessarily wasn't, at least in the Egyptian context. In any case, politics does intervene not only in the shape and form of architecture, but also in the very much in the lives of people who produce built forms, such as, say, Karim, Max Pasha before that. So I try to highlight these stories and bring them to the foreground. So not only was he very prolific in terms of designing buildings and even urban plans, some of which have been implemented, not only in Egypt, but also regionally. I even saw a project that was for Caracas in Venezuela, no idea, no information about it. So what do we do with that kind of material? Projects in Algeria and so on, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Jordan. So quite prolific, but also published the first, what at least I can identify now as the first known Arabic language magazine focused on contemporary architectural practice at the time. So very important figure. I'm just going to go through a couple more of these. This is all of them. Oh yeah, so maybe I should say something about proposed projects. So it was really important for me when trying to piece together. I'm not so concerned with a narrative, which is perhaps why the book is not a typical kind of text. I can get back to that. I was much more interested in making accessible as much as possible of the buildings that we know something about in terms of who, when, where, to be able to allow a wider audience to be able to sort of piece their own picture together. And this is why it's kind of a building-driven, geographically driven, organized book in that way. Hence, the guidebook format was very useful. But in doing this, it was very clear to me that not only is this particular context of Cairo unusual because of the wealth of building practices, the diversity, but also how quickly a lot of it disappeared because of, well, we can talk about the reasons, very lax heritage rules, very conflicted narrative around who owns modernism. Are these forms foreign? Are they local? There isn't a genuine discussion within Egyptian universities because there are no art or architectural history departments within architecture schools in Egypt. They learn the same textbook that you learn in New Jersey, which is pretty ridiculous. And so they actually have no awareness as students in particular specimens, which means that the history of architecture that's right beneath their feet is completely invisible. And so you can imagine what implications that has, not only on, well, the formation of students of architecture in subsequent generations, the conceptions of what heritage is. So much is impacted by this slip. So this is why it was important to also include not only extant projects and demolished ones, but proposed ones, because it was very clear that a lot was proposed that was never materialized, and that this comes from a very particular, again, political context, why this is the case. But it seemed necessary that whenever possible, whenever relevant, to include proposed projects, as people are constantly looking for, what could have been if we can criticize, I suppose, a particular urban situation. But then there always comes the so what next? And so I think the what next has been said before many times with these proposals that were never circulated enough, and therefore not part of this architectural discourse. So it was important to include those as well. And then I'll go quickly through the words, just to kind of recap for those who visited and to give a summary for those who haven't. So you learn about geographic areas. You learn about, again, these kind of thematics, useful thematics maybe, to position a lot of this architecture. Throughout, I use QR codes to link to Google Maps in the case of geographic areas, but also additional online resources like film trailers, documentaries, and so on, which may be useful. And you can see that this is a primarily graphic exhibition, and I can talk about that a bit more, but maybe important to point out these two boards in the very end one that has to do with heritage, and the other one that has to do with research. I don't know if I should talk too much about this now, but it was really one of the things that are really important for me with doing this work. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to get to exhibit this at the Center for Architecture in New York, is to actually not conceal the unevenness of the research terrain that we confront. Some people can go to Columbia Avery Library, and make a request, and then when they go, they can find 20 or 30 or 50 or whatever entry folders with drawings, details, and exchanges. Is for some people who do some kinds of research, but this is not the reality of doing architecture around the world. And so that was something that was important for me to bring to the forefront and not to conceal. We were talking about disasters. We're talking about complete disasters. We're very vibrant professional associations, not to mention careers, were completely destroyed in the last several decades, what we're calling our contemporary modern so-called global world or economy or culture that we are supposedly all inhabiting. In that process, quite a lot of destruction has been happening that actually impedes architectural research, whether directly or indirectly or why not. That's besides the point. We know what happened. Architectural studios were confiscated, archives were scattered, photography studios were closed. We don't know where the photography went, and so on. Students of architecture, are harassed. Your photography outside touristic areas is frowned upon. How can you research documentation of architecture, especially when there's so much foundational work that hasn't been done already that we can build on? How can you do all that in a situation in which simply taking a picture of an old villa can end you in a police station? And that's in fact what happened with many of the members of the team that worked on the book and myself. So it was important to bring that up. And I love this photo. It was taken by a pharmacist, which is actually fantastic because I want to remind people that architecture is not something that only architects and art historians should be concerned with. And more than anything else, architecture is literally the stuff that shapes our everyday lives. And one of the things that make me very optimistic in Egypt is how the audience of architecture is not just architects. In fact, most of the people who are very interested in architecture and social media and architectural heritage are, like this man, pharmacist, people who are not, they're not the people that we are used to in other contexts to be the ones who are interested in architecture. Anyways, I include the photo in the exhibition because I think it raises a very straightforward question, which is what are the political, whatever realities that have created these two vastly different architectures in the same location within the span of less than a century. So it's kind of a nice moment where you see the present and you see this particular past or slice of the past that we're interested in, modern architecture, and to sort of just raise the question right there. So what happened between this and that, which honestly for me goes back to the very first question that came to mind when I was a student and I was still trying to figure out what I will study. It was a very glaring contrast between the present and this particular slice of the past. And so that's where that is. The Al Imara wall, as you see it, magazine culture is extremely important. In the exhibition, I include links to download the entire run of Al Imara, which is digitized by Harvard Libraries, and Alam al Bina, which is another magazine that ran from 81 to 99. So these are really, and maybe this is also important to mention why Cairo Observer exists, because I was aware of this legacy of previous architects who were in whatever means made sense at the time, created magazines and other activities around, essentially architectural culture. I think this is very much a big inspiration for why something like Cairo Observer was necessary. Just one last, so the timeline comes with sort of basically two boards. One is this sort of a provisional history, is to remind people that history is not linear and so on, what I mentioned earlier, but also the 5 points toward decolonizing the history of architecture, which I'm honestly a little bit surprised that it's even provocative for anyone, just because it says things like that we live in a world basically that was designed around the challenged superiority of the white male. I mean, I think that should be pretty standard understanding of what the history of the last 500 years has been, really. And so in any case, as a cheeky sort of nudge, whatever, at the 5 points toward a new architecture by Le Corbusier, which was published almost a century ago and has expired a very long time ago already, but God knows we all get taught this stuff, which is really incredible, as not as a sort of a fragment of a thought at a certain place in time, but actually as something to be adhered to. It's quite really bizarre when you see the ways in which things like Le Corbusier's 5 points of architecture are taught in the so-called decolonized global South, which is hardly decolonized or whatever, but that's another point for discussion. So in any case, the 5 points are not aesthetic. I don't think the move away from the very colonial structures that shape not only our understanding of architecture today, but history, but also architectural practice. To decolonize is to change the structural system, not to respond with representational elements, whether in architecture or by appointing a certain person of color in your department so that you feel that you're decolonizing architecture. That's not necessarily how it works. So to recognize that history is not linear, to recognize the impact of colonialism in its past and present forms on architectural production, but also on the fate of archives and heritage. I really like this quote because it sums up a lot in like 4 or 5 words, which is the only primitivism is Eurocentrism. I mean, well, Eurocentrism is something that that's completely inescapable. And it clearly comes with a very particular mindset that has root in this colonial exploitative project, which is primarily economic, but has really fantastically used culture to sell itself. And I think we're all still participating in that process. So in any case, the only primitivism is Eurocentrism is 3. And to decenter architectural knowledge production, I think is completely frustrating in 2021, given everything that's been going on, to see that architectural departments and institutions that are completely separate from reality in Ivy League schools clustered in very particular geographies, that they think that this is going to be the place from which a global history of architecture will emerge. Not really sure what kind of who's fooling who here, but decenter architectural knowledge. It seems like an obvious one, and paired with that is to also decenter the production of meaning and value. I think whether we're talking about Detroit or we're talking about Cairo, if local communities are the ones that are deciding what's important to them and what it means, as opposed to a historian flying in, parachuting in from across the world, probably because they can, because of a particular economic, cultural setting that makes that happen, to parachute any place and to be the ones that assign meaning and value of what means what and what's important and what we can include in our global history books, that is completely missing the point. So in any case, so that's that. And I think this is a pretty good recap of the exhibition. Alex, let me know if I've missed something in terms of covering the actual exhibit, some of the ideas behind it. But I really want to open up for discussion because I think that'll be a much more productive way of using our time moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Great to see the overview. Not all the students were able to come on the weekend, so good for them to get an overview. And for those of us who are joining us from elsewhere, I'm going to invite a couple of students to come up and ask questions. If you are in the audience, on the webinar and have a question, just pop that into the Q&A box and we will ask that for you. So,
thanks for the lecture. Thank you so much.
It wasn't much of a lecture, but thank you.
It was really enlightening, but I have a couple questions for you.
Yeah,
First,
please.
what kind of limitations did you notice, or like when you were doing your research on demolished buildings and on buildings that never came into fruition? Did you run into any limitations with the research?
So the question is about limitation in research, and in particular, demolished buildings, how to, right? Okay, so I think, yeah, that's it. Should I go on?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the question of demolition is very interesting for me because it's very visible right now. In fact, the list of buildings that we had started with when I was putting together the book, already throughout the whole production process, buildings that were still extant while writing the book were being demolished. That's a pretty difficult thing to witness, because to actually make some of those selections meant you had to choose a very small sample out of a much bigger landscape of architectural production in order to say something about maybe what some of the trends that are going on within this landscape. Now, once that's already a process, but by the time you get to a list to already have buildings before your eyes being demolished while working on a book, it's a pretty alarming situation. And I say this because demolitions have been and are extremely active in places such as Egypt, generally places that I think the question of preservation manifests in very different ways in different national contexts. But it is related to the question of demolition, because ultimately it's a question about choosing what do we keep and what do we not keep. So if you don't have a clear democratic process of how that goes about, then somebody else is making a decision as to what a society should not keep. Now, if this is happening fast enough and in large quantities, and at the same time it's not paired with institutions that are concerned with documentation of these buildings, then you're in a really catastrophic situation. I'm trying to walk us through the implications of what we talk about when we talk about demolitions. It's easy, when I came back to New York to install the exhibit, I had a very interesting reaction. I lived in New York for some time years ago, maybe a decade ago now. And I've visited many times since, but somehow having my mind completely wrapped around the context like Cairo, where demolitions are very present, to come back to New York City, where there's a lot of development, it seemed strangely stable. I don't know if I can describe this. I can't experience that kind of stability in Cairo, where buildings are disappearing all the time. And remember, once they disappear, that's it, right? Whatever's going to replace them is often for real estate speculation. So it's driven by a certain kind of economy. And that economy is on the back of a certain kind of dictatorship system that is allowing or needs corruption in order to actually survive, which is actually what colonial corruption does. This is how it manifests on the local level. Colonialism as a system, if it operates on corruption as one of its foundational mechanisms. And so it's really fascinating to watch how that then translates into a dictatorship on the local level. I don't separate these invasive political systems, whether it's colonial or a dictatorship that's backed by former colonial powers, And so demolition and the lack of information and archives are all part of that kind of landscape for me. It's all about erasure. It's about a kind of a presumption that there's nothing important here. This is essentially what any colonial power does to a place. So that operates until now under the current political structure. People are free to think what they think of that political structure, but it's very challenging because you're talking about a landscape in which it's normal for cities to demolish and rebuild things. right? There's a kind of nobody's saying that you cannot demolish anything, but it's very different when the demolitions target a very particular slice of history, and they make it completely invisible, both in the physical world, but also in terms of the archive and documents. So this is very challenging, and this was why it's really important to include no longer existing buildings in an architectural guide. I want people to actually go to the site and see what was there. It's a big group of people.
Yeah. Okay.
I hope some can come forward.
Okay. Huzaifa's gonna come up.
Yeah, thank you.
I was gonna ask, why focus on Egypt and not other places like Turkey or India or like the US, for example?
Yeah. So Egypt for me was a kind of an obvious go-to for a couple of different reasons. I'm Egyptian, whatever that means. I mean, I was born in Alexandria, Egypt. Let me put it that way. And that was an important place for me to actually, to shape my conception of what the built environment can look like. As someone born in the late 20th century, Alexandria was my reference point, in addition to Kuwait City, which is a place where my parents worked and lived for some time. So that was kind of the geographic pull, but I've also been an immigrant, and my family immigrated to the United States, lived there for, 15 years nonstop. I was based there. First 10 years as an immigrant, I was 15. I never returned to Egypt. So I say this because why Egypt, not only did it have a lot of impact on my formative years in terms of thinking about architecture in the built environment, but also I had been so detached from it for such a long time at that point that it made sense that this is where I would like to go to explore, to also see where I come from. And it happens then that the 2011 uprising happens as I'm writing about the relationship between architecture, politics, and revolution in relation to the 1952 coup d'etat. So you can see how things kind of all come together, not necessarily planned. I mean, obviously they didn't plan to be experiencing a revolution when I am writing about a revolution in the same place, and the relationship to architecture of those things. But it was very clear that architecture played a key role, not only in the shaping of spaces and people's understanding of where the society, but also the unmaking of architecture and the control of architecture in urban spaces that are shaped by architecture, were literally the glue, or that kind of the main component, let's call it, in what was going on politically during the uprisings of 2011. So for multiple, and that of course drew my interest in what was going on in that particular place. Also, I'm fascinated by people who feel very comfortable to talk about other geographic contexts that they don't have personal connections with. I think that's actually fascinating, and I'm always trying to pay attention to how that happens and how it works. But it can also, one can view it as being something that's possible because of a certain set of privileges. For example, as an Egyptian American doing this research in Egypt, it was a very bizarre, because on the one hand you feel slightly privileged, but then you are aware, or I was aware, of the very real colonial presence of Egypt today, being part of American empire ultimately. So Egypt just seemed like the obvious. A lot was going on also, like I said, while I was there, to witness, and on top of what I was pulling out of archival materials and magazines. I just think it's really key. But historically, besides all of this, Egypt is a curious place. I'm not saying every place, in a way. If we follow this model that I'm proposing in the 5 points toward decolonizing architecture, of decentering architectural knowledge, and to decenter the production of value and meaning, I think Egypt is kind of it's fascinating because it was at the intersection of really key political shifts that are shaping our world until today. Socially, it had a very interesting melange of people, mix of people who happen to be in this particular place. I try to highlight this with the biographies of architects. You have an Italian immigrant who then becomes the chief architect of the Awqaf administration, religious endowment administration, as a Catholic in 1927. I mean, 1927, try today to have a Muslim or a Hindu design something for, let's say, a church in New York City. It's going to be a controversy. I mean, this is apparently not even an issue that in 1927 this happened.
We have one more question from a student. This is Asma.
You talked about this before, about how preservation is like different for different people and different cultures. And I was expand on like your idea of preservation for you and for Egypt, as opposed to how we think of it here in the West.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's a huge topic, and honestly, I feel like it deserves a lot more work. Our models of preservation have been, I would say, shaped by ideas of preservation that didn't come from the places where those ideas are applied, and often because they don't fit other places, then they end up being discarded altogether, and then you end up having, well, practically no preservation at all. So, and this depends on what segment of architectural history you were talking about or heritage you were talking about. So a couple of general things to say here. One is, it's really important to think about let's say you have to find a point. Let's say, since I used 1900 in the book to start my survey, let's go to pre-1900. Pre-1900, most Egyptians, the way we've been able to at least identify, I mean, if it's okay for me to generalize, and not only Egyptian cities, but I think in a lot of places, you would find a kind of a cumulative growth and development. And there's a certain kind of, the value is often attached to things, not in a symbolic way, you know what I mean? So real estate today, for example, when you see that, watch one of those real estate videos of a penthouse in New York City or something, it's like the most expensive penthouse. It's completely symbolic, that number, the value that's attached to that piece of real estate is not actually what it costs to build. It has nothing to do with the materials that are being used. That's not really what it's about, right? It's about kind of symbolic value that's created around real estate. That's not how things have been almost ever. In let's say a pre-1900 world, in Cairo, for example, that's not how value was determined. Things were worth what they were worth because of what they are. And there is, what that means is when you rip down an old house, you reuse as much of the old house as possible. And we see fragments, architectural fragments from older buildings that make their way into newer buildings. And so there's that kind of cumulative development or growth of architecture. What's really nice is, along with that, oftentimes people left also documents. They knew that they are reusing the old portal to a hammam into a new house or whatever it may be. And then this gets noted and we know it. And so there is preservation, also kind of intellectual preservation, the fact that buildings have memories and those memories are oftentimes written down and so on. So that's one approach. That means that a city can change, of course, but when it changes, it incorporates as much of what it already has into the new that it's creating. I would say, from our vantage point today in 2021, that sounds like a pretty good idea. I think what we've abandoned, sort of where architecture has gone and its relationship to real estate and its relationship to this sham of an economy that we're all supposed to embrace, is clearly not how things have been in most places around the world. So that's one general point I want to make out, that there is a local approach, notion of preservation that is built into the fabric of a place. Now, things don't have to continue in that particular way, but what has happened in the 20th century in a place like Egypt, to be specific, are multiple political and economic shifts that very few cities I can think of can survive them. Imagine if New York City or Newark, let alone New York, whatever, any of those, well, North American cities, going through two back-to-back political economic shifts, such as the ones that Cairo experienced in the 60s and 70s. Imagine if the government decides to take all assets of wealthy individuals who may or may not have actually had posed a threat to a new political order. So you may want to control them by actually sequestering their assets, their buildings, and nationalizing them as a gesture to the masses, the poorer masses, that you are doing something good for the general good of society. And then within a decade, politics change and shift again, and the open door policy, which is an American-driven policy, Kissinger type ideas, was implemented in the 1970s forward, which meant that the government should sell all of its assets. So suddenly, all of this all these private assets, all these buildings that were commissioned by individuals, families, businesses, mostly the Egyptian architects from this particular era, from the beginning of the 20th century up until the 1950s, most of it was sequestered by the state, and then within a decade or two, liquidated and sold. Imagine any city in North America surviving something like this. It's pretty rough. The impact of this on preservation is also pretty radical, because it means that there's a kind of a shift of who owns wealth and power, and they don't want to link themselves to the previous owners of wealth and power, who now they own their, whose assets now they own. So it's very natural for a new elite to demolish, in this particular situation, where it's very politically contentious. Maybe in other places that wouldn't be the result, but in this one, it turned into the new elites demolishing most of what was inherited, quote unquote, to them through these problematic political economic policies back to back. And so they demolished them, not out of evil or anything like this, but because mostly, if you're buying a property in a particular economy where if you demolish the property, but you can build in its place a building where you can make a lot of money, of course, there's going to be an incentive. So everything was designed in a way to incentivize the demolition of a certain kind of architectural product in order to make room for speculative real estate that would benefit a new elite. Where do preservation policies come into play in something like this? At those very same years, the state was, as in many other post-colonial countries, was looking or framing pre-colonial constructions, whatever that may be, whenever you want to mark that, as more authentic, and that those should be the ones that should be preserved. That's not even the case. Just a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, I believe, 1,000-year-old Wikela, which is a kind of a commercial building in a very prominent location, was demolished. There are demolitions, the positing of preservation is something that should be kept for only pre-colonial buildings, because those are the pure, not yet contaminated by Western influence. Even that doesn't apply, but it becomes a kind of a facade for a regime that actually doesn't care about history in general. I mean, all of this stuff is being really demolished left and right, whether it's modern or pre-modern, however we define these terms. I find these terms to be very problematic anyway, and they actually facilitate this kind of demolition machine to keep going. Since we don't have clear categories and terms to describe things, it makes it much easier for them to be targets for erasure. That's another point to make. I just want to also contextualize here, and if I'm going on too long on the issue of preservation, let me know, is that after World War II, what happened in Europe is a preservationist impulse to basically protect everything that was left and rebuild so much of what was destroyed, as if the war never happened, and a lot of American money went into this. So a very particular notion of preservation was formulated. That came out of that political context and economic context. I feel like the idea that people want to copy paste models of preservation in other contexts, not where that just wouldn't make sense, is not helping anyone. So I can say a few more things, but I'd love to engage with someone to like keep the conversation going so that I'm not just sort of talking to myself.
Okay, so thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions? So I'm just wary of our time here. I have lots of questions for you, but I think I'm going to email them to you afterwards. But I would really love if you could talk to our students just a little bit about your time as a student at NJIT and how that led you to this career and how that has influenced your life. Like, why is New Jersey important or not to your personal growth as a scholar? We'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, thank you, Alex. I mean, I think one of the things that I have become very comfortable with in the last couple of years, maybe that wasn't the case before 2020, to this degree at least, is to be much more at peace and comfortable with incorporating our personal stories into the work that we produce, because I think too much of what I read and learned made so much more sense years later when I learned more about who wrote it or who said it. And I think we tend to sort of minimize that a bit. And I think that's not really fair to ourselves, especially when we have these kind of life stories that shape that have to do with colonialism, with immigration, with exploitation, with displacement of people, with erasure of their heritage, the personal and the political. And I kept saying this over and over, almost in every conversation or interview I've had about this project, is how the personal and political are really intricately linked, and it's always been the case. I mean, can you really talk about Le Corbusier without talking about his personal and political connections? You really wouldn't be able to understand. This is the inherited narrative that we have, is one that takes that away from the story. So we kind of create these kind of figures who are, whether we're reading them or reading about them, we don't know too much about where they come from. So anyways, New Jersey for me is a place of immigration. It is also a place of learning about things from a vantage point that I wasn't cultured into, a vantage point that looks, that has an us and them built quite strongly. This is the US. A situation in which the very mechanisms that produce immigrants also, from the other side, produce certain narratives about immigrants, which is ultimately very useful to place them within a certain kind of workforce. I say all of this because actually architectural education for me in New Jersey was fascinating for a couple of different things. By the third year, I knew I wasn't going to be continuing to practice as an architect from my observations of what I was seeing was going on around me, especially students who already were starting to apprentice in offices, drawing doorknobs, hallways, and toilets for free for New York-based offices who are barely making money anyway. It just seemed like, what is all this about? Why are there hundreds of students graduating from these programs every year if the marketplace, blah, blah, blah. These kinds of thoughts were very clear. And this is what took me to stay in a university environment primarily, and I'm very honest about this, as a safety precaution to protect myself from this very strange society that I just got plugged into. So for me, the university, this is why it's really funny to me when I present the work of modernist architects, for example. One of the first questions I always get, and I just got in an interview and I'm like, my God, I'm not trying to shame people for ignorance, but at this point, if you're a New York-based writer, journalist, whatever, and you're not able to be up to date onto what's going on, then you don't really have an excuse. And what's going on is that we know from scholarship in the last 20 years that certain narratives and histories are just were BS. And one of the main questions that really come up about this question of education is, where were these architects educated? And this is why I brought up the anecdote about Said Karim arriving in Zurich the same year that Hitler comes to power. So this cannot in any way be a good situation for an Egyptian international student. This is happening in the 30s, but I'm also thinking about us now as international students or immigrants or children of immigrants going to schools in places like Rutgers or NJIT. The school of where, the question of where you were educated is in no way a key to explaining what the person is and what they know. I mean, my education in the US cannot in any way be used as a key to explain my thinking. Just like Said Karim's education in Zurich for a few years it's not like he was indoctrinated into some sort of embrace of the modern. So simply by entering the doors of a school in a European context, you come out a modernist the other end. That's completely ridiculous. And so question narrative, identity, present student, and it's because of the absence of narratives that have to do with architecture that got me interested in architecture in the first place. Not only were they absent from our education, and they still are, but also there is a kind of a general narrative that is such as what William says, William Curtis. This is why I put that particular quote on the wall, because there's a put down narrative around the things that are not included. So not only are we talking about the universalization of very provincial narratives, we're also talking about essentially white liberal dudes, it's always men, at least most of the time, who not only are they provincial in what they present, but they have a put down narrative about everything else. And that was very frustrating for me as a student. What is this person talking about? But the funny thing is, you say that as a 20-something young student or 20-year-old student, what is this person talking about? And then here I am 40 years old saying practically the same thing, but now I can say it to a group of students, right? So it's kind of just fascinating how watching how my educational experience in an American context as an immigrant, the narratives around architecture, which you can take that and extrapolate it into narratives within art history, which is probably one of the most problematic fields I've been exposed to, and so on. And yeah, it's a lot of exclusion. And so I guess the short answer, I just give a long answer, but the short answer is my experience in New Jersey was very formative in shaping what I need to respond to, unfortunately. And I think I just want to point out that it does not feel very nice to end up spending a career responding because others are just saying things, right? So privilege plays out in really fascinating ways, just even in what we have to say in terms of as scholars or as individuals or as students or so on within the university context. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. But I would say just before leaving it is that it's really in the context of everything that's going on in the world, if this is not a time to rethink all of these categories that we've all been imprisoned by, all of these ridiculous narratives that whether they're coming from liberal voices or not, have white supremacy at their bases or whatever they may be. If this is not a time to upend all of this and challenging it, then we may be missing a really big opportunity. Maybe a big opportunity, but it may be the only one. So one of those I love to challenge, and I said this when I came to give a lecture last in March 2020 pandemic at NJIT. I said my own school, I said, we need to rethink the model because I came out of this context and I know that there's way too many students prepared for things that they will never actually be able to use professionally down the line. So you may end up a historian or a freelance critic, or you may end up doing whatever other, but not everyone is going to graduate from these programs being Zaha Hadids and Rem Koolhaases. And I think it's just like pretty obvious, but it's time to really snap this because a lot of the students are international. A lot of them are immigrants. A lot of them come from humble backgrounds, and particularly in schools like where I went in NJIT, and to be able to look at a group of students like this, then graduating, to not even be able to help themselves or their families because of the economy that we all have to live in is pretty ridiculous. I was in school mostly to protect myself from this new society that I was plugged into, but I wouldn't say that that was formative in thinking about what I want to write about. Let me just put it that way.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you all. And I'm happy to answer any questions by email if Alex, if you'd like to collect questions and send them to me, I'll be happy to answer them as well.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thank you so much. Take care. Bye. Take care.